Hi, welcome to Don't Miss to come follow me this week. We're Alma chapters 43 through 52. We're the beginning of the war chapters, which is one of my favorite parts of the Book of Mormon. I love them, and so we'll be in these chapters that talk so much about the battles between the Nephites and the Lamanites for the next couple of weeks. And so some folks really are not fans of the war chapters because they're so much strategy and who is where and what leaders are doing what, and sometimes it's confusing, and they're like, why is this all in here in the first place? I love the war chapters because they teach me how to do battle with the adversary in my day by learning how they battled their adversary in their day. So I've taken the opportunity, as I've read the scriptures this week, that I made a perimeters of defense in our day list of scriptures. And believe it or not, I ran across 84 scriptures in just the course of reading this week of all of the different perimeters of defense that Moroni and Heavenly Father and Alma and Helaman have all put into place to keep the people safe. And I thought, this is so good. Let me share what I learned with you. So if you need a copy of that, I'll try to figure out how to post that somewhere so you can have an access to that if you wanted to study all of those perimeters of defense. And it's not just the battle plan, it's your battle plan for the way you live today, and how to protect you and your family and those you love from the spiritual battles of the adversary. So with that being said, let's dive in. In chapter 43, verse 1, I love verse 1. It's when Alma has, he's got some boys that are older guys, Helaman and Shiblon, Corianton, and they all are like, you know what, Dad, we recognize the importance of going out to teach the gospel to all the people. That's our part of how we help to keep everybody safe. And so we're going to go out and we're going to do it. It's what you've been doing all your life, and Dad, you look tired. Why don't you just go home and rest? Hang out with Mom, maybe garden a little bit, take some naps, just really take a break. And so Alma does go home, and he tries to rest. And in 43 verse 1 it says, I'll read it to you. He says, and Alma also himself could not rest, and he also went forth. He tried, but that prophet just knew that all hands on deck needed to happen, and that even though he had worked his entire life without a care for himself, he knew that more was required of him, and so he went forth also. It's interesting that as we look through these chapters, we get a really good glimpse of what makes a great Lamanite military leader and what makes a great Nephite military leader. There's a lot of things that you learn through the war chapters, things like what's your attitude towards this war, spiritual battle in our day, the importance of supporting the government that protects you, the power and the influence of a righteous home. All of these men came from righteous homes, grew up with righteous moms and righteous dads, and in those communities that supported and nourished the spiritual strength. So what does that look like? And they recognize that's one of the reasons why Moroni is so adamant that we defend families and homes, because he knows that's where it all starts, and that's what builds the righteous Nephite nation, is the power of a mom and the power of a dad, the power of one. He also, other things that the war chapters teach you is that a person's external circumstances need not determine their attitude or their faithfulness. It teaches us why God allows the righteous to be slain, and also that you get to see a prophetic pattern of what is to come in their day, and as it unfolds, and then you can take those same things that we've learned and apply them to our day and how our day is unfolding. It's very much the same. So when you look at the job requirements for a Lamanite leader, they usually drew from the applicants, those guys who were Amalekites and Zoramites. Those are former Nephites who were dissenters and moved over to the Lamanites. They found that those guys were meaner, more wicked, had more hatred. They were really great at keeping people stirred up to anger, and that is an important skill set for a Lamanite leader. Also, they did things like preserving the hatred towards the Nephites, usurping power over them, working hard to bring as many Nephites into bondage as possible. Those are all great Lamanite leadership qualities. And for a Nephite general, in chapter 43, verse 9, this is what they're looking for. Someone who would, support their lands and their houses and their wives and their children, that they might preserve them from the hands of their enemies, and also that they might preserve their rights and their privileges, yea, and also their liberty, that they might worship God according to their desires. That's what makes a great Nephite leader. And so I think it was interesting. Think about someone who was born in 1995. That would make him about 25 years old right now. My son Brandon, he's 25, and he's an awesome guy. And I think about, how much life he's experienced and how much life is ahead of him. And amazingly enough, when the Nephite want ad went out there, it says, we need to find a guy who's to be in charge of all of the government war affairs. And he's in charge of all the captains and all the captains of captains. And, he's the top dog. He's the guy who does strategy, who does supplies and provisions, and what is the all the different trails and what's the map of everywhere look like, and what he's in charge of keeping all of the cities safe and all the inhabitants safe. All of that is one guy's job. And he's also the liaison with the chief judge, who at the moment is that they confer back and forth. One keeps the Nephites spiritually safe, and the other one keeps them physically safe. And so they kind of are work side by side a lot. And so I would think if you were looking for that kind of a guy, you'd want somebody who is seasoned in battle. He has been out in the trenches and he knows how to do all that stuff. Amazingly, they pick Moroni. Moroni is 25 years old. A lot like my son Brandon. He's 25 also. And it's amazing because Moroni has this patriotic heart that is unstoppable. He's a righteous man, and he is so determined to protect and preserve everything that he loves. And he just will invest his entire life in that pursuit. And that's who they select. And so it's amazing to see Moroni in action, but to remember how young he was when he started. One of the first things that Moroni did when he was asked to fulfill this role, he said, I need to talk to God about how to do it. And so he prayed, and Heavenly Father said, one of the things we need to change about this is how we actually do battle. And so Moroni came up and presented this plan. He said, everybody, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers that we're talking about, and they're all over the Nephite kingdom, not just in Zarahemla, but everywhere. And he says, all of our soldiers need to have battle dress. Here's what battle dress looks like. Here's what it's made of. You need to have thick clothing that you wear underneath everything. And then you need to fashion a helmet like this. You need to fashion a breastplate, a backplate, arm shields, everything that protects your core, your legs, all of these battle armor garments and protective things. Every soldier needed them. And they did. And every soldier made them, and every soldier had them. And so their very first battle that they meet with the Lamanites, it scares the Lamanites a lot. And so much that they, and even though the Lamanites, there were like way more Lamanites than there were Nephites on the battlefield, they still saw the very appearance of all of this protective armor that these Nephites show up with, and they just have like their loincloths and shaved heads and and spears and arrows, and that's it. And they're really exposed, and it scared them. And so they left, they ran. And Moroni sent a message to Alma, and he said, I don't know where they went, but I need to track them down because I don't want them to get away from me. Our goal is to have them make a covenant to be peaceful. And there's a whole bunch of guys that we can if we can do that with them, that would be super. So he sends this message to Alma. Alma prays and asks Heavenly Father, what should Moroni do? He gets an answer, and the messenger takes it back to Moroni. This takes time, right, to get all that back. And so Moroni, when he gets the answer from Alma, he doesn't question it. He doesn't take Alma's advice and say, okay, Council of War guys, come on, let's talk about what God thinks we should do. He just does it. He is so obedient and he's so faithful. And so he just places his guys wherever Alma had said that Heavenly Father told him to have them, and then he waited. And so one of my favorite verses, it's so tiny and it's kind of such a goofy little verse, but it's in 43 verse 33. And it's one of those perimeters of defense. And it says, and thus having placed his army according to his desire, he was prepared to meet them. And I think about how you and I, at this moment, at this day, we are exactly placed where we are and when we are, because that's where Heavenly Father wants us to be. And now he is prepared to meet and do battle with the enemy. And so you're exactly where you should be. And so I think it's important to recognize that that's one of those parallels between their day and our day, that you are where you need to be. One of the things that I love is that, let's see, the next thing that, he does track him down, and Moroni they get into this very terrific, hard battle. The leader of the Lamanites, his name is Zerahemnah, and he is a tough bird. And so the battle has commenced, and the Nephites are really causing a lot of death and destruction among the Lamanites. And Moroni stops this battle on 3 different occasions. They're winning, and he stops the battle, and he makes everybody quit right where we are. And he conferences with the leader of the Lamanites, who is Zerahemnah, and he says, here's the plan. If you will do 2 things. One is bring all of your weapons of war and throw them on this gigantic pile over here. And then everybody shuffle past me and make that covenant of peace that you promise for the rest of your life to be not be in the work of destroying the Nephite people, that you will live in peace and harmony with the Nephite people for the rest of your life. And if you do those 2 things, you can walk away today and walk home and be with your wives and your children and your communities, and you can be alive. And Zerahemnah gets mad. The first time Moroni stops the battle and they have this conversation, he's really mad. And he says, okay, I'll tell you what, we will throw down our weapons of war. We'll make that giant pile of weaponry over there, in the field, but we're not going to make that covenant, because you know what? We know we won't keep it. There's no reason for us to make a covenant that we'll be covenant breakers, and we just know it. And so we'll give you the weapons, and we'll just go home. We'll make more, and we'll keep coming after you. But if you want a break, I guess we can do that. And I love how Moroni, and then he said, the reason that you're winning, Moroni, is not because this God of yours is championing you and giving you the advantage. It has nothing to do with this God guy that you keep saying is the reason you're successful. He says it has everything to do with this fancy battle gear that you guys have invented. You got this thick coverings, clothing, and all this breastplates and helmets and arm shields and back shields and leg, guards. That's why you're winning. And so Moroni, I love in verse 10. I have a red heart on top of verse 10 because I love it so much. And it says, this is in chapter 44, verse 10. And now when Zerahemnah had made an end of speaking these words, Moroni returned the sword and the weapons of war which he had received unto Zerahemnah, saying, "Behold, we will end the conflict." So he basically said, "Okay, here's your sword. Here's your stuff. Let's just keep battling and killing each other. If that's what you want to do, okay." You know? And so Zarahemnah, that made him really mad. And so he grabbed his sword, and, and I guess Moroni is getting ready to, let all the other, guys know we're going back into battle. Zarahemnah said he was going to not do this. And he doesn't recognize that Zarahemnah has the sword in his hand, and he's like ready to just dart forward and kill Moroni. That's what's happening. And you know what happens? We have a power of one guy moment right here. We don't know his name. We know nothing about him other than he was a friend of Moroni who was watching Moroni's back. And he sees Zarahemnah grab his sword and lunge forward with intent to kill. And he intervenes. He jumps in between Moroni and Zarahemnah, and he uses his sword and he hits Zarahemnah so hard, and he takes parts of his scalp off. And then, in all this commotion, he picks up that bleeding, gross scalp on the tip of his sword, and he puts it high over his head, and he yells at those Lamanite soldiers that are right there. He's like, "This is what is going to happen to you, and worse, if you do not make a covenant of peace, and you do not lay down your weapons of war, and we will do it." And it scared him. This loud guy. And I thought to myself, wow, who is around me in my circle of friends? Who is my power of one guy that's got my back? Is there someone that is just one of my friends, that's someone that I keep close to me? Who is it that would be that person who would jump in between and notice that the adversary was getting ready to attack me or my family and jump in the middle and defend me? Who is that? And I thought to myself, we all have those people in our lives, and we all are those people in our lives. And so we just have to keep protecting and preserving each other. And I thought it was amazing. And so the other thing that was interesting is in that scripture that there were so many Nephites who were scared about what just happened that they did, or Lamanites, they came forward, they dropped their weapons of war in a giant pile, and they came, past with Moroni, and each one of them, one by one, made a covenant that they would no longer persecute and try to kill the Nephites, that they would live in peace with them. And then they went home. And I thought to myself, how did that go when they went home? How did their communities receive them? Did they reach in, open arms, welcome home, we're so glad you're back and you're safe? Were they persecuted because they were traitors? Did they have to kind of take their families and just leave the communities that they all grew up in? We do know in the scriptures as we read through this week that a whole bunch of them packed up their wives and their children and everything they had and went to the people of Ammon, who are the anti-Nephi Lehis, right, in the land of Jershon, and they said, "Can we come live with you?" And the people of Ammon were so welcoming, and they're like, "Absolutely, come live here, let us love you, we will make a place for you, we love that you're a covenant keeper, because we are too, and come be like us." And so some of them got, that's how their life unfolded. But so I thought that was interesting. Zarahemnah was so mad, and he continued to battle, and that battle was stopped 3 different times, and finally, it just, it concluded. Zarahemnah did not make it, and was killed in that battle. So in chapter 45, we have something that's interesting. I kind of got a pause button on that war, and we jump into kind of go from war to peace here, and we visit with it's a interview between Alma and Helaman. Helaman is his son, and he says, "I got some questions to ask you," and they're very direct questions, and he wants to determine what is Helaman's spiritual temperature, right? And it's interesting that the questions that Alma asks Helaman are really super similar to the questions that my bishop asks me when I go in for a Temple Recommend interview. I love those questions, and I love those interviews because it feels so good to tell my bishop that I am working so hard to be on the covenant path and to live a righteous life and to do all that I can to be a noble daughter of God. And I love those interviews. And so this is one of those moments where we can see Helaman and Alma interacting in this way. Alma's purpose is that he needs to have someone to pass the sacred records onto, and all of those sacred items like the Leahona, the sword of Laban, all of those relics, those spiritual relics that are a part of the Nephite history, all of that goes to the keeper of the records. And so Helaman is our new guy. Once he hands over that power and that authority, he says, let me share with you a vision that Heavenly Father gave to me about our Nephite nation. And he kind of shows Helaman, tells him, we're not going to make it. And he goes through the how. Let me see if I... sorry. He goes through the how, the when, the where, the why, the who, the when. He goes through all of that to show how the Nephite nation just dwindles in unbelief. They get worse. And here's all of those signs of going from being on a covenant path to being under the adversary's control and eventually to become extinct. And it's really sad to have, Alma tell Helaman this, because Helaman now recognizes that try as hard as he will, it's not going to matter. It might matter for some of them, for some a generation or two, but it's not going to stop that, and that's really sad. Alma, after he finishes his conversation with Helaman, he packs up his stuff, and he's in, they're in Zarahemla right now, and he says, I'm on my way to Mulek, so, I'll see ya. But as he journeys from Zarahemla to Mulek, he disappears. Gone, vanished. The people, kind of said, well, maybe he was like Moses. Maybe he was just translated, and that's what happened, because he wasn't buried. They didn't find his bones anywhere. He just vanished. And I think about how hard that would have been for Helaman. Alma was the guy he could ask those questions to that only a prophet experiences and knows. And he's like, I need guidance. And his dad's gone. Think about Alma's sweet wife and their friends and their family, their children, their other children, how hard it was he was just gone, just like that. So that's really hard. So Helaman and his brothers do exactly what they've been taught to do and what they've watched the spiritual leaders do for all their lives. And so they go through all of the communities, and in chapter 45, verse 23 and 24, it says, And now it came to pass that after Helaman and his brethren had appointed priests and teachers over the churches, that's what they're supposed to do, that's what they've always done, that there arose a dissension among them, and they would not give heed to the words of Helaman and his brethren, that they grew proud, lifted up in their hearts, because of their exceedingly great riches. Therefore they grew rich in their own eyes, and they would not give heed to their words to walk uprightly before God. How frustrating would that be? Sometimes, we think about how, I guess what came to my mind was your calling that you have, and, these guys, your calling does not exalt you. It doesn't save you. It doesn't keep you spiritually safe. You got to work for that on your own merit. Just having the calling doesn't do anything, right? But it also made me realize how grateful I am for our good leaders today. The leaders in my ward and in my stake, and even, the leaders from, the global perspective, President Nelson, the Quorum of the 12, all of those leaders. I just am so grateful for their humility, for their desire to serve and to be good men and women and to really be like Moroni, to be that strong defender of our faith alongside me. I'm so grateful for good leaders. So in chapter 46, we really see that the beginnings of civil war are just really, it's getting intense. There's a quote from Hugh Nibley, if you remember who Hugh Nibley was. He was such a great scriptorian and gospel scholar, and he said something that I thought was really interesting to kind of tuck in right here. He said, Amalickiah is one of a long line of brilliant troublemakers who keep things stirred up. Beginning with Laman and Lemuel, you meet in order Sherem, Noah, Nehor, Amlici, Zeezrom, Korihor, Zarahemnah, and now, neither last nor least, Amalickiah. All these men had certain traits in common. All were personally ambitious and unscrupulous, aspiring to be either king or the religious head of the people. All were powerful speakers and clever propagandists, skilled in the use of flattering words. All sought to undermine, if they could not seize, the highest authority of the church and state, being particularly opposed to popular government and drawing support from those who sought to overthrow it. Thought that was really interesting. And Amalickiah, in 46 verse 5, he's kind of got a little bit of a campaign promise out there. He wants to be king. He is a Nephite, an obvious Nephite, and he's a descender from Nephites. And so he's in the middle of this Lamanite territory, and he wants to become the king of the Lamanites. And he says, if you will support me as being the king, I'll take you with me, and I will make you rulers over the people with me if you support me. And that's kind of, drawing on greed and pride and all of those things. He really was really good at those flattering campaign promises. The irony of the wars in the book of Alma and Helaman is that, the Nephites were righteous enough to win the wars, but they were not righteous enough to prevent them from taking place. Kind of a, how close to the edge can we live without stepping a toe over what's not okay? How close can we get to being, mostly righteous, but not completely, they were starting to kind of like creep closer and closer to that line of that fall. So, Amalickiah is a power of one guy for the other team, and his opponent is Moroni, and it's so amazing in when they go power, head to head. Moroni gets so irritated and so, it says that he was angry because of the way that the Nephites were behaving. He was giving his absolute all and best to protect and preserve them, and he made him so mad that the people were apathetic and were not industrious in preserving and protecting their own country. And he was just so upset about that. So one of the things that he did was he took his coat, ripped it in half, and painted on it what we call the title of liberty. And he fastened it to a pole, like maybe his spear, and he rode it through town. And there were 6 things that he wrote on his title to liberty, of things that he was working hard to protect and defend. And the 6 things they're listed in Alma 46 verse 12. And it says, and it came to pass that he rent his coat, and he took a piece thereof and wrote upon it, in memory of our God, our religion, and freedom, and our peace, our wives, and our children. Those are the 6 things that he felt were the most important things to defend. And so he took that through, and he rode that through community after community, and I love the way that people responded. And so it is, let me see, where is it? Alma chapter 46, verse 21. And it came to pass that as he's going through these communities with his title of liberty, and it came to pass that when Moroni had proclaimed these words, behold, the people came running together with their armor girded about their loins. They came running, dressed to battle, dressed to defend and protect and preserve those same 6 things. And I thought to myself, how am I doing now? Am I running? I'm not just walking, I'm not wandering in, I'm not thinking about it. They came running, dressed for the battle ahead. And that's such a great imagery for us to determine, how are you? What are you doing? And at what pace are you being a covenant keeper? So I thought that was important. And let's see. Let's flip ahead to chapter 47. That Amalekite, they had gone through these battles with each other several times, and let's see. One of the things that Amalekite wanted to do is he wanted to become the king of the Lamanites, and so he figured out a way to accomplish that. Then the Lamanites were scared of Moroni and his the battle dress, and they basically refused to go to war. The king of the Lamanites commanded that they go to war, and they said, no way, we're not doing it. And so they gathered their families together and their tents and all their stuff, and they left, and they went up on a high mountaintop, and that's where they set up camp. They figured, we can see who's coming, we're protected up here, and we're just going to stay here, mind our own business. We do not want to be Lamanites, and we do not want to be soldiers for this cause. We don't believe in it anymore. And so the king of the Lamanites sent Amalekite after him. And it's interesting how Amalekite did that. He kind of stood at the bottom of the mountain. He says, Lahontai, who's the guy in charge of all the people there, he's like, come on down. It's dark. Let's do this at night so no one sees that you're coming, so no one can tell that you've come down to talk to me, so you're not embarrassed. Right? No one will know. How many times have we heard that? No one will know. Do it anyway. And come on down in the dark. You don't have to bring anybody with you. Just me and you. We'll just chat. And Lahontai is like, no way. And so then Amalekite goes a little bit further up the mountain, sends him another message. Lahontai, come down and talk to me. Nope, not doing it. He comes up a little higher. Lahontai, come, look how far I've come up to get close to you. Come down and meet with me. And Lahontai is like, absolutely not. So he comes right up to the edge of camp. And he says, Lahontai, look how much faith I have in you, that we're going to be okay. Please come talk to me. I have a solution. And so Lahontai says, well, okay. And so he comes down to the edge of his camp, and they hatch a plan. And it's not really Lahontai's plan, it's Amalekite's plan. And he says, here's what Yanit wants you to see. He says, I have a way for you to capture all these Lamanites that are down in I don't want to be king of these, I don't want to be in charge of these guys, I want to be with you. And so here's how you can surround them at night. I'm going to let that happen. You surround them and they'll surrender, and then me and you will be a team. It's interesting that, Amalekite's whole purpose in life was to bring Lahontai down. That is Satan's job also, to bring the people down. And the other thing that he did is once he recognized, once Lahontai agreed, he figured out a way to remove Lahontai so that he could now be in charge of all of the people, the Lamanites' army that they captured, and Lahontai's people. And it's interesting because he says in verse 18, and it came to pass that that Amalekite caused that one of his servants should administer poison by degrees to Lahontai, that he died. It's very subtle, very sneaky, but by degrees. And I thought to myself, that is that's exactly what Satan does. He is a huge fan of the gospel principle, small and simple things. Satan knows that by small and simple things are great things brought to pass. And so that's why he is able to persuade people by small ways. Dallin H. Oaks said this. He said, Satan seeks to deceive us about right and wrong and to persuade us that there is no such thing as sin. This detour typically starts off with what seems to be only a small departure. Just this once. One fill in the blank won't hurt. No one will know. What all of these departures have in common is that each of them is addictive. An addiction is a condition in which we surrender part of our power of choice. And that's how Satan works best. So I thought that was such a strong concept. The other thing I think about is Richard McLendon said this. He said, some of our young people who are sincere in their desire to help their wayward friends may unwittingly end up going into the enemy's territory to try to bring them back to the gospel side of the line. They may think, if I go to such and such party, I can be a positive influence by not drinking, and thus encourage my struggling friends who will see my good example. Unfortunately, they don't realize that by doing this, they are entering into the adversary's stronghold, and they must realize that the odds are against them. It's kind of what happened to Lahontai. And it's evil can look so right up to when it's decidedly and dreadfully too late, and it's not okay. So that's how it works. Let's see. Let's go up to chapter 48 next. And in chapter 48, it talks a lot about. Don't you love it when pages stick together? There's a whole lot of perimeter of defense things in chapter 48. But the things that I love in chapter 48 are that Moroni puts forth, it says in verse 10, this is a little bit about how Moroni's efforts to live on the covenant path, he did what he was asking his people to do. Kind of like, that primary song, Do As I'm Doing? That was Moroni. And in verse 10 of chapter 48, he says, and thus he was preparing to support their liberty, their lands, their wives, and their children, and their peace, that they might live unto the Lord their God, and that they might maintain that which was called by their enemies the cause of Christians. And it talks a little bit about the character of Moroni here. And it says that Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. He was a man of perfect understanding, and a man who did not delight in bloodshed, but a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country and his brethren from bondage and from slavery. Verse 12, yea, he was a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings which he bestowed upon his people, a man who did labor exceedingly for the welfare and the safety of his people. What a power of one guy. Yea, and he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, and his country, and his religion, even to the loss of blood. And then jump ahead to verse 17. It says, yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been, and were, and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, and the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. So let's be like Moroni. So it's interesting that after that wonderful description of who Moroni was and how Moroni was, in chapter 18, it's interesting. He says he was like unto Ammon, the son of Mosiah, yea, even like the other sons of Mosiah, yea, and also Alma and his sons, for they were all men of God. Now behold, Helaman and his brethren, those are the sons of Alma, behold, Helaman and his brethren were no less serviceable unto the people than was Moroni. And I thought that was kind of, no less serviceable. They weren't bad themselves. It's a humorous way to describe it. But Howard W. Hunter, who was a prophet in the 90s, it was just there for just a year or two before he passed away. He said this. I love this quote from Howard W. Hunter. He says, "Not all of us are going to be like Moroni, catching the acclaim of our colleagues all day, every day. Most of us will be quiet, relatively unknown folks who come and go and do our work without fanfare. To those of you who may find that lonely or frustrating or just unspectacular, I say you are no less serviceable than the most spectacular of your associates. You too are part of God's army." I love that. I think that's just so wonderful. In chapter 50, there's something that kind of caught my attention that I thought was pretty powerful, and it's in verse 21. This is talking about the Nephites and how they are doing spiritually and in their communities, and it says, "And we see that these promises which have been verified to the people of Nephi," you remember Alma's vision that he shared with Helaman. That's what he's talking about. He says, "For it has been their quarrelings and their contentions, yea, their murderings and their plunderings, their idolatry, their whoredoms, and their abominations, which were among themselves, which brought upon them their wars and their destructions." And so I thought to myself, those are the things that cause the spirit to depart. But it also becomes an open door and an empty, inviting space for the adversary to fill. So when you push the spirit out and you push those righteous things aside, that leaves a gap inside you that is just an open cup waiting for the adversary to fill his stuff inside you. So he's saying, you really need to be aware of that. One of the things, there's a power of one woman that is, again, just a small snippet, not much. The leader of Morianton, he's one of those guys. He's a Nephite, and he's trying to pull Nephites away from the body of the Nephites to come and do the things that he wants to do. He's a dissenter, but he's still in Nephite territory, and he says, you know what? We don't want to. He's one of those king men, and he's like, we don't want to be. They're having, the people of Morianton and the people of Lehi are having, their neighbors, and they're having land disputes between the two of them, and it got really heated. And Moroni said, you know what? This is in chapter 50, verse 26. He says, "Behold, the people who possess the land of Morianton did claim a part of the land of Lehi. Therefore there began to be a warm contention between them, insomuch that the people of Morianton took up arms against their brethren, and they were determined by the sword to slay them over land that they wanted to steal." And so Morianton is a bad guy, and he's put it into the hearts. He's like, you know what? Let's just leave. Let's just flee into the land northward. And Moroni got really mad about that, and he came after him, and he said, let's see, where am I? So one of the things that he didn't know, Moroni didn't even know this was happening, but Morianton was kind of a passionate, angry man, and he beat one of his maidservants a lot, and she snapped. So she fled in the middle of the night, and this is in verse 31 of chapter 50. "And it came to pass that she fled and came over to the camp of Moroni and told Moroni all the things concerning the matter. and also concerning their intentions to flee into the land northward. And so that's that power of one moment. And what I noticed was, what I noted down there was, when you are not sure that you should speak your voice on the matter that matters to you, that's this woman. She didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but she felt like someone needs to know. And because that one moment and her bravery and her courage to speak up and to she had to put some effort into it. She had to flee her home and find Moroni's camp and tell him everything that she knew. That one moment saved so many people and changed the course of history for the Nephites. And I thought that was a great power of one moment that just you don't really notice. You just kind of read over it real quick sometimes. In the end of chapter 50, it's time to confer the records and the judgment seat upon someone new, and the son of Nephihah is the guy who's going to become the new chief judge. And in verse 39, there are I think it's 6 different things that the chief judge promises to do. He makes a covenant to do all his days. And that is, he says, I promise that I'm going to judge righteously, I'm going to keep the peace, I'm going to keep the people free, I'm going to preserve the freedom of worship, I'm going to support God's cause, and I'm going to maintain God's cause among our people all the days of my life. That's my covenant and my commitment that I make if I'm going to be your chief judge. And so Nephihah did that. And it's interesting, in chapter 51, there's a lot of people who want to have a king. They call themselves king men. And so they kind of whip up the passion of the people that we want a king, we want a king. And so they go to Nephihah and they say, here's the law that we want changed so that we can alter the structure of our government so that we can have a king. And Nephihah says in chapter 50, the verse 39, he refers to that, and he's like, there is no way that I am going to go against the covenant that I made. This is in 51 verse 3. It says, and behold, Pahoran, who's the new chief judge after Nephihah, he says, behold, Pahoran would not alter nor suffer the law to be altered. Therefore he did not hearken to those who had sent in their voices with their petitions concerning the altering of the law. He said, I'm going to be a covenant keeper. And I have decided that's who I am. And it made them really, really mad. And they decided, you know what? We are going to retaliate. And we're in the middle of this huge battle with the Lamanites. We're not taking up arms. We're not going to defend your liberty and your rights and your laws. And, we're not helping you. We want a king. And we're not going to battle for you. We don't care about what you want. And some people say, it talks about in verse 14 of chapter 51, Moroni says, it came to pass that when Moroni saw this, and he also saw the Lamanites were coming into the borders of the land, he was exceedingly wroth because of the stubbornness of those people, whom he had labored with so much diligence to preserve. Yea, he was exceedingly wroth, and his soul was filled with anger against them. Sometimes people look at that scripture and they say, wow, Moroni had a temper tantrum. He was angry all the time. And anger's bad, and you should never be angry. And they can't believe that Moroni would give in to this anger. I guess what I want to point out is there's many types of anger. And so this kind of anger that Moroni is expressing right now, it's like exasperation. He has given his whole life and everything about him to preserve their liberty, to make this country safe for you. And so he's got some resentment in there. It's just indignation. They're antagonizing him. They're aggravating him. And that's when he says he's angry, that's why. Not that he's filled with hatred or malice or jealousy or any of those sides of anger. he is, he's just so upset that they don't get it, that he's doing everything like to protect them and their homes and their wives and their families. And so he says, you know what? In verse 16, I love that he says that he says, it was his first care to put an end to such contentions and dissensions among the people. That was his absolute first and foremost thought always, is to eliminate contention and to eliminate dissension among his people. And so I thought, how do we do that in our world? What about in our families, or in our wards, or in our communities? Or how do we act like that, like Moroni? And that's our first care, is to be peaceful and to encourage peace and to do away with contention and dissension. And how does that happen? What does that look like for us today? How do we do that? And so it's interesting that Moroni recognizes that these are the roots of evil. You remember the allegory, in Jacob chapter 5 with the olive trees, and some of the roots were great and produced great fruit, and some of the trees, the roots were evil, and there was just no saving that fruit. Moroni recognizes that this is the roots of evil moment that's happening in his nation, and that's why he's so angry, because he's like, I'm trying so hard to keep you guys safe. What happens during this whole chunk of time is the Nephite cities that they had preserved and protected and redesigned for safety, 6 of them got captured by the Lamanites, and they couldn't get them back. But the thing that was the bigger worry, that inside those cities were Nephite families, whole families, that were now bondage, slavery to the Lamanites, who would not be treating them very well. And so the word of the Lord came to Moroni and said, you know what? We got to handle things a little differently. In 52 verse 8, it says that, and Moroni also sent orders unto him that he should retain all the prisoners who fell into his hands. For as the Lamanites had taken many prisoners, that he should retain all the prisoners of the Lamanites as a ransom for those whom the Lamanites had taken. If you remember, up to this point, the Lamanite battle plan is catch and release, right? We capture you, you give us your weapons of war, you make a covenant, you can go home. Those days are done. Moroni has received revelation from God that says, keep them all. And we're going to use them as to barter to get these families back from the Lamanites. And so it's so interesting to see how the Lord is so caring and compassionate when part of the people are trying so hard to be obedient and good, and part of the people could care less, and they're all in the same nation. How does that balance work? It's important to know that Satan is just relentless in using that strategy to just pluck out a few here and a few there, and just to kind of keep slowly strengthening his team. And I guess what's important is that you just never underestimate the size of Satan's hosts. Never underestimate who they are, where they are, how they are, when they are in your life. That's what these war chapters teach us in the Book of Mormon. Okay, so next week, here we go. We're studying the rest of the chapter, the rest of the Book of Alma. So it's chapters 53 through 63, and it's called Preserved by His Marvelous Power. Just to keep a heads up for you, there's 11 chapters that we got to plow through this next week, and there's 26 pages, so kind of pace yourself if you want to make sure you get it all covered. In this week, this coming week, we meet the 2,000 stripling warriors. It's awesome. And we get to see what Book of Mormon hate mail looks like. The exchange of epistles back and forth gets sometimes kind of heated. We see that Moroni thinks that Pahoran's, who's the chief judge, is just not getting it, that he needs more men, he needs more provisions, he needs more supplies, he has these, if I'm going to do my job, you got to do your job, and he gets mad that it's frustrating, and so he sends that letter to Pahoran, who Pahoran's reply is so gentle and so awesome. So we get to hear that. We get to see that more of the Lamanites join the Ammonites. Bad news in the next few chapters, that Teancum, who is a huge military leader alongside Moroni, Teancum dies, Helaman dies, Moroni dies. But all of these good men are replaced by good men also. And so that's kind of what we have to look forward to next week. I hope this has been helpful. Take care, and we'll see you later.